Some memories glow like amber, preserving the past in a beautiful, frozen moment that never truly fades away. We revisit the turning points of life and the lessons that stay with us forever. Hit subscribe today and hold on to the memories that matter most.
You don't belong at this table, Maya. My brother didn't even look at me when he said it. He just kept adjusting his cufflinks, the ones my father had engraved with the Calloway family crest, the ones that were supposed to be mine. Stand by the door and make sure no one comes in without a badge. You're good at that, following instructions. I didn't argue. I walked to the door, clasped my hands in front of me, and checked the time on my phone. 11 minutes. The acquisition team from Harlow Capital was arriving in 11 minutes, and my brother had no idea that the woman he just assigned to doorman duty had been on their payroll for 3 years. To understand how I ended up standing at that door, you have to understand my father. Gerald Calloway was a man who believed that confidence was the same thing as competence. He built Calloway Logistics from a single leased warehouse in Cincinnati into a regional freight network with 8 facilities and roughly 400 employees. He did it through instinct, stubbornness, and an unshakable belief that the right man in the right room could talk his way through anything. He was proud of that. He repeated it at every holiday dinner, every company anniversary, every moment he had an audience. The right man. That phrase did a lot of work in our household. My brother Derek was 11 years older than me. By the time I was in middle school, he was already shadowing my father at client meetings, already being groomed for the role that had been decided for him before I was born. My father bought him a truck at 16. At 22, he was handed the title of operations director. At 27, he was given a corner office with his name on a brass plate and a company card with no spending limit, and an unspoken understanding that Calloway Logistics would one day bear his name alone. I was the afterthought. I was the daughter my father had not planned for and never quite knew what to do with. He was not cruel to me, not exactly. He just looked at me the way you look at a piece of furniture that came with an apartment you rented. You did not choose it, you tolerate it, you move around it. When I told him I wanted to study finance, he nodded and said that was probably practical for a girl. When I graduated top of my class from Ohio State, he shook my hand at the ceremony and then spent the drive home talking to Derek about a new fleet contract. When I got hired at Harlow Capital straight out of grad school, he asked if that was like a bank. I said it was more like a private equity firm that specializes in acquiring and restructuring mid-market logistics and supply chain companies. He said that sounded complicated and changed the subject. He died 14 months ago. Heart attack. Sudden. No warning. He was 61. The will was read 3 weeks after the funeral. Derek got the company. 80% controlling interest in Calloway Logistics, the flagship warehouse in Cincinnati, the lease agreements, the fleet, the client contracts, the brass plate on the corner office door. My mother got the house in Marblehead and a trust that covered her living expenses. I got a savings bond my father had purchased in 1994 in a jewelry box that had belonged to my grandmother. I sat in the attorney's office and I did not cry. I did not yell. I looked at the jewelry box sitting on the table in front of me, and I thought about the last conversation I'd had with my father, 6 weeks before he died. I had driven home for his birthday. We had sat on the back porch after dinner, and he had told me, quietly, almost like he was embarrassed to say it, that he was proud of me, that he knew he hadn't always shown it, that he thought I had turned out better than he deserved. I had held on to that for 6 weeks, and then the will was read. Derek winked at me across the table when the attorney finished. He actually winked. What I did not tell Derek, what I did not tell anyone in that room, was that I had been assigned to the Calloway Logistics account at Harlow Capital 4 months before my father died. It was not a coincidence. The company had been bleeding quietly for 2 years. My father had been masking the losses with short-term credit lines, kicking the problem forward, the way men like him always do when they refuse to admit a strategy isn't working. Derek had been expanding the fleet aggressively, signing long-term lease agreements on trucks they didn't have the contracts to fill. The margins were collapsing. I had flagged it in my first internal memo. My father didn't know I was the analyst on his file. Harlow operates through shell entities when they approach targets. The name on the acquisition paperwork was Meridian Freight Solutions. My father thought he was being courted by a regional competitor. He had died before the deal closed. After the funeral, I had a choice to make. I could have recused myself. I could have handed the account to a colleague and walked away with clean hands and a clear conscience and a savings bond that was worth $412. I thought about it for exactly 1 day. Then I remembered the wink. I didn't walk away. I closed the deal. Harlow Capital had acquired a controlling debt position in Calloway Logistics 8 weeks ago. Not the equity, not yet. but enough leverage that when the next balloon payment came due on the fleet leases, the company would have exactly one lifeline, and that lifeline ran through me. Derek did not know this. He thought he had inherited an empire. What he had actually inherited was a company-shaped hole in the ground that happened to have his name on the door. Today was the day he was going to find out. The acquisition team had scheduled what Derek believed was a routine refinancing consultation, a chance to renegotiate the fleet debt under more favorable terms. His CFO, a nervous man named Peterson, who had been with the company for 11 years, had set up the meeting and briefed Derek on the basics. Derek had responded by buying a new suit and telling Peterson to make sure there was good coffee in the conference room. He had also told me, his younger sister, who happened to be visiting from out of town, to come in and make myself useful by standing at the door. I stood at the door. The elevator opened at exactly 9:51, and James Whitmore walked out, followed by two analysts carrying portfolios. James was Harlow's head of acquisitions. He was 60 years old, 6'2", and had the energy of a man who had restructured more companies than Derek had ever visited. He wore no tie. He never did. He walked past me without slowing down. His eyes swept the room the way they always did, cataloging exits and power dynamics in the same glance. Then he stopped, turned back, and looked at me with something that was not quite a smile. "Miss Calloway," he said quietly. "You ready?" "I am," I said. He nodded and kept walking. Derek was already standing at the head of the conference table when we entered, hand extended, smile wide, the full performance. He had our father's handshake. I'll give him that. Firm, two pumps, eye contact. He had practiced it for 30 years. "Derek Calloway," he said. "Welcome to Calloway Logistics. We're excited to talk about the path forward." James sat down without shaking the extended hand. Not rudely, just efficiently. He opened his portfolio and looked at Peterson. "I'd like to start with the fleet liability schedule. Can you pull that up?" Peterson went pale. He looked at Derek. Derek's smile held, but his eyes shifted. He gestured to the chair at the far end of the table, the one farthest from the whiteboard, the one where you put vendors and junior associates. He looked at me and said, "Maya, sit down there and take notes. Try to keep up." I sat down. I took out my phone. I pulled up a document I had prepared at 2 a.m. the night before, one I knew by heart, but wanted to have in front of me for precision. James was already speaking. He walked through the fleet numbers with the patience of someone who had done this many times and felt no need to perform urgency. The numbers were not good. The utilization rate on the leased fleet had dropped to 61% in the last quarter. The break-even on the lease obligations required sustained utilization above 78. The gap was not closing. It was widening. Derek interrupted twice. The first time to say that Q4 projections were strong. The second time to say that his father had built this company from nothing and the bones were solid. James let both interruptions pass without acknowledgement, the way you let a car alarm go off in the distance. Then he placed a single document on the table. "This is the current debt structure," James said. "You'll see that the largest single position, the fleet lease consolidation debt, was purchased from First Midwest Lending 6 weeks ago by a firm called Meridian Freight Solutions." Derek frowned. He leaned forward. "Who is Meridian?" James looked at me. That was my signal. Not because James told me to stand. Not because anyone in that room expected me to do anything except take notes. But because I had been waiting for this moment for 14 months, and I had promised myself I would not rush it, and I had not rushed it, and now it was here. I stood up. I walked from the far end of the table to the center, where the projector remote was sitting next to Peterson's coffee cup. Peterson moved his chair back slightly, instinctively, the way people do when they sense a shift in gravity. Derek watched me with the particular expression he reserved for when I did something he hadn't pre-approved. Irritated, slightly confused. Still not alarmed, because it had not yet occurred to him that there was anything to be alarmed about. "Meridian is a Harlow subsidiary," I said. I pulled up the first document on the projector. Incorporation records, filed in Delaware, beneficial owner listed as Harlow Capital Management. Derek looked at James. "What does that have to do with—" I pulled up the second document. "This is my employment record at Harlow Capital. Senior acquisitions analyst, hired 3 years ago. I have been the lead analyst on this account for the past 7 months." The room went quiet in a specific way. Not stunned silence. Processing silence. Derek's jaw moved. "You work for them?" "I work with them," I said. "There's a distinction. But more relevantly, I have been the person running the numbers on this company since before Dad died. I know every lease agreement, every client contract, every deferred maintenance cost on every truck in your fleet. I know that you signed a 10-year lease extension on the Columbus facility 4 months ago without telling Peterson, And I know that you expensed $43,000 in personal travel to the company card in the last fiscal year and coded it as client development. I know, I said, because I had been the one to find it, because that is what I do for a living, and because you handed me a savings bond at the reading of our father's will and actually winked at me. Derek stood up. His chair rolled back and hit the credenza. This is a conflict of interest. This is illegal. You can't. It was reviewed and cleared by Harlow's legal team 3 months ago, James said, without looking up from his portfolio. Miss Calloway recused herself from any decisions that occurred before the estate was settled. The acquisition of the debt position closed afterward. It's clean. Derek turned to Peterson. Did you know about this? Peterson looked at the table. I pulled up the third document. This is the acceleration clause in the Meridian debt agreement. You signed it, I said. Page 11, section 4. In the event of a change of ownership or management restructuring, Meridian retains the right to accelerate the repayment timeline to 90 days. Your father's death triggered the clause. You have been in technical default for 6 weeks. Derek's face had moved through several phases and had settled on something that was not quite anger and not quite fear. It was the face of a man who had spent his entire life being told he was the asset and was understanding, for the first time, that the ledger had been kept by someone else. You set this up, he said. His voice was lower now. You planned this. I didn't plan Dad dying, I said. I planned for what came after, because that is what I do. I assess risk. I build contingencies. I have been doing it professionally for 3 years and informally my entire life, because when you grow up as the backup plan, you learn very quickly that no one is going to build a net for you. So you build your own. I placed 2 documents on the table in front of him. Option A, I said. Harlow accelerates the debt. 90 days, full repayment. The company doesn't have the liquidity. You know that, and I know that. The fleet goes back to the lessors. The Cincinnati facility gets sold to cover the balloon payment. And whatever's left gets distributed to creditors. It's a clean wind down. Probably takes 8 months. The 400 employees go find other jobs. Derek stared at the document. Option B, I said. Harlow converts the debt to equity. 51% controlling interest transfers to Meridian. You retain 49%, a seat on the board, and your salary. Peterson keeps his job. The employees keep their jobs. We bring in a restructuring team, cut the underperforming leases, renegotiate the Columbus facility terms, and actually fix what Dad spent 2 years pretending wasn't broken. The room was very still. Under option B, I said, you report to me. Derek looked at me for a long moment. I watched him cycle through the responses he had prepared for a version of his life where he was always the protagonist. The intimidation response, the dismissal response, the call Dad's attorney response. One by one, they became unavailable to him, like exits on a highway he had already passed. What about Mom? He said finally. His voice had changed. There was something almost small in it. The house is in her name, I said. It's not part of the company structure. She's fine. He looked at the document for another moment. Then he picked up the pen. He signed option B. I slid the document back across the table to James without looking at it. James countersigned, stood, and began organizing his portfolio with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had somewhere else to be. Derek remained in his chair. His new suit jacket was draped over the back of it. His cufflinks caught the light from the window, the ones with the family crest, the ones my father had given him. I picked up my phone from the end of the table where I had left it. I walked to the door. I stopped with my hand on the frame because there was one more thing, the thing I had written down at 2 a.m, and then crossed out, and then written again, and then crossed out again, and then decided, finally, to say. I turned back. Dad told me he was proud of me, I said, 6 weeks before he died, on the back porch. I don't know if he told you the same thing. I hope he did. But I need you to understand that I did not do this to hurt you. I did this because this company employs 400 people who had nothing to do with what happened between us. And someone who actually understands the numbers needed to be in charge of it. That person is me. It has always been me. You just never looked long enough to see it. I walked out into the corridor. The elevator was already open. I stepped in and let the doors close behind me. My phone buzzed before I reached the lobby. A text from Peterson. 4 words. Thank you. We're okay. I put the phone in my pocket and walked out into the gray Cincinnati morning, past the loading dock where my father had taught himself to drive a forklift 30 years ago because he believed that a man who ran a freight company should know every job in it. He had been right about that. He had been right about a few things. I didn't look back at the building. I had already memorized it.